The seeds of discord. In the charming suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Heights, where manicured lawns stretched like carpets and white picket fences outlined every yard, the appearance of serenity and harmony was, to outsiders, unimpeachable. The community, however, was not without its undercurrents, and no one understood this better than the neighborhood's longest-standing resident, Mrs. Edna Blackwell. Edna, at 73, was a petite, silver-haired woman with a deeply lined face that could switch between kindly smiles and disapproving scowls in a heartbeat. A fixture in Oakwood Heights, she had watched generations of neighbors come and go, while she remained in her large Victorian home, steadfastly tending to her famed rose garden. She was also known for her lemon bars, the cornerstone of every community gathering, although fewer people looked forward to her conversations, which often laced gentle Southern charm with veiled bards and outdated ideas. Mrs. Blackwell's reputation was cemented as the unofficial watchdog of Oakwood Heights, ensuring that the standards she valued remained unchallenged. The neighborhood's tolerance for Edna's behavior stemmed from the perception that she was merely a product of her time. A generation removed from the progressive ideals that younger residents often held, her views were largely ignored by neighbors, who were content to exchange pleasantries and keep their distance. Some suspected that her need to assert control over her surroundings was born out of loneliness, especially after the death of her husband years earlier. But none in Oakwood Heights dared to address it directly, and so Edna's control over the neighborhood's sense of decorum remained untouched. This sense of control, however, was challenged with the arrival of the Johnsons, a young couple who had moved into the house directly next of Edna's. Michael Johnson, a 32-year-old software engineer, and his wife, Sarah, a 30-year-old pediatrician, were an appealing, optimistic pair. They had moved to Oakwood Heights only 6 months ago, excited by the neighborhood's quiet charm and the chance to create their own sense of home in their modest, 2-story cottage. Their friends described them as compassionate, hardworking, and open-hearted, qualities they wore with pride as they began to establish their roots in the community. For the Johnsons, the move to Oakwood Heights was part of their shared dream to live in a warm, friendly neighborhood where they could eventually raise a family. They were well-educated and had traveled widely, making friends from all walks of life. To them, the world was an open space, brimming with connections, and their friends reflected this inclusive worldview. This openness, however, was precisely what triggered Mrs. Blackwell's suspicions. Edna had watched them warily from her window the day they moved in. Her curiosity piqued when she noticed the diverse crowd helping them unload boxes and furniture. She had never seen a group of neighbors like this in Oakwood Heights, and the sight unsettled her deeply. Over time, Edna found herself irritated by the Johnsons' lively gatherings, their unfamiliar music floating over the fence on Sunday afternoons, and their frequent hosting of friends she couldn't recognize or place. Despite there being no real reason to feel threatened, Edna convinced herself that the Johnsons represented an unwelcome change, one that could disrupt her carefully preserved world. One crisp spring morning, as Edna pruned her roses, she overheard a snippet of conversation that set her nerves on edge. Sarah was discussing plans with a friend about an upcoming wedding. The words floated over the fence, seemingly innocent, but to Edna, they held a foreboding weight. She strained to catch more details, but all she heard was laughter and talk of decorations, catering, and logistics. It became clear to her that the Johnsons were planning their wedding. In their backyard, no less. Mrs. Blackwell's mind raced with scenarios of a loud, chaotic affair that would shatter the peaceful atmosphere of Oakwood Heights. In the following days, as wedding preparations took shape in the Johnsons' backyard, Edna's misgivings grew. Her concern turned to indignation as she saw lights being strung from trees and chairs being set up in neat rows, all while friends and family bustled about, transforming the yard into a whimsical romantic setting. She convinced herself that the ceremony would be an over-the-top display of their foreign customs, despite no actual evidence to support her assumptions. The music and laughter she heard, rather than filling her with curiosity or warmth, amplified her unease. As Edna's sense of foreboding grew, Her loneliness became more pronounced. She spent more and more time watching her neighbors, scrutinizing every detail. Her resentment turned into determination. She was convinced she had to do something to preserve Oakwood Heights' atmosphere. On the morning of the wedding, a plan began to take shape. The day dawned clear and bright, the ideal weather for a celebration. Guests began arriving at the Johnsons' home, dressed elegantly and smiling warmly as they greeted each other. The soft strains of classical music floated through the air, adding to the picturesque scene. Edna, who had spent the morning peeking through her curtains, felt a tight knot of frustration. How could they disrupt the neighborhood with this gathering without considering the implications on their neighbor's peace? Her hand shook as she dialed the number she had only ever called in emergencies. "There's a disturbance next door," she reported, her voice low and shaky, but determined. "I think it's an illegal gathering, or at the very least, a public disturbance. Please send someone quickly." As she hung up, Edna felt a conflicted mix of satisfaction and apprehension. She believed she was upholding the standards of Oakwood Heights, protecting it from the influence of outsiders. But as she returned to her window, a small part of her wondered if she had overreacted. She brushed the thought away, focusing instead on the imminent arrival of law enforcement to set things right. Meanwhile, in the Johnsons' backyard, the wedding was underway. Michael stood at the altar, nervous yet filled with joy, as Sarah made her way down the aisle, her face radiant with happiness. Friends and family looked on, holding back tears, their hearts warmed by the love that surrounded the young couple. In the beauty of that moment, their world felt perfect and full of promise. But just as Sarah reached Michael's side, a commotion at the front of the house pulled everyone's attention. The wail of police sirens cut through the ceremony like a jagged knife, turning joyous faces into expressions of confusion and concern. 2 police cars pulled up, lights flashing, and 2 officers stepped out, looking as bewildered as the wedding guests at the serene scene before them. As the officers entered the yard, the soft murmurs of confusion among the guests turned to tense silence. Michael, dressed in his tuxedo, stepped forward, his face calm but questioning. The lead officer cleared his throat, his face strained with discomfort. "We received a call about a disturbance," he explained, shifting uneasily. "Something about an unauthorized gathering." Sarah, stunned and hurt, joined Michael at his side. She addressed the officer calmly, but with a trace of indignation. "This is our wedding. We followed all the necessary protocols for a small outdoor gathering. There's no disturbance here." As the officers glanced at the assembled guests, they seemed to realize the absurdity of the situation. But before anyone could speak further, Edna appeared at the edge of the yard, her face a storm of pride and righteous indignation. "Yes, officers," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. "I'm the one who called. They're disturbing the peace with this display. This is supposed to be a quiet neighborhood, not some festival of strangers." A collective gasp rippled through the guests, and Michael's face hardened. "Mrs. Blackwell," he replied, his voice tense but controlled, "this is our wedding. There's nothing disturbing or strange about it." But Edna, unwilling to back down, addressed the officers once more, her voice tinged with defensiveness. "Look at this crowd. They aren't from around here." The officer's face turned a shade of uncomfortable red, while the guests stood in silent outrage, realizing the true motivation behind her call. But before anyone could say more, a black sedan pulled up at the curb, and from it stepped a distinguished man and a poised woman, both in their early 60s. The guests turned and gasped, and a look of shock spread over Edna's face as the newcomers made their way towards the newlyweds. Sarah, her eyes widening in recognition, called out, "Mom, Dad?" Her parents were none other than Judge William Cartwright, a respected figure in the state, and his wife, Dr. Evelyn Cartwright, a civil rights activist known for her compassion and eloquence. As they greeted Sarah and Michael, Judge Cartwright turned his attention to the officers and Edna, his face a mask of quiet authority. In a single day, the tight-knit neighborhood of Oakwood Heights had been irrevocably altered, leaving Edna to grapple with the shattering realization that her assumptions, once her shield, were the very things that would soon isolate her in ways she had never anticipated. A shattered illusion. The wedding guests, still processing the abrupt arrival of the police, watched in a tense silence as Judge William Cartwright turned his attention to Mrs. Edna Blackwell. Standing there in her garden hat and floral print dress, Edna looked like a statue, frozen in her growing shame. She was accustomed to holding the attention of her neighbors, but this attention felt different, a piercing glare that revealed the flaws she had carefully concealed for years. Judge Cartwright's presence carried an unspoken weight. Not only was he a respected figure in the community, but his career as a jurist was marked by his integrity and commitment to justice. His wife, Dr. Evelyn Cartwright, known for her work on civil rights, stood by his side, her expression firm and unwavering. "Officers," Judge Cartwright said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded respect, "I believe this is a misunderstanding. My daughter and her husband-to-be are holding a legal, peaceful wedding ceremony, with all necessary permissions and permits in place." The officers, visibly embarrassed, nodded in understanding. They had already realized the peaceful setting was far from a disturbance, but were now unsure how to extricate themselves gracefully from this situation. One officer approached Michael and Sarah, his voice low and apologetic. "We're truly sorry for the disruption. This call shouldn't have warranted our presence." Meanwhile, Edna's expression shifted from righteous defiance to an unsettled combination of frustration and regret. For the first time, she seemed to realize the true weight of her actions, though she wasn't yet ready to confront it. She folded her arms and muttered, "I was only trying to maintain the peace in Oakwood Heights." Judge Cartwright, overhearing her comment, turned to Edna, his voice as firm as steel. "Peace, Mrs. Blackwell, does not come from divisive actions or unwarranted assumptions. It's built through understanding, not through prejudice." The rebuke, though measured, struck Edna to her core. She felt a deep flush rise to her cheeks, and she fought the urge to turn on her heel and retreat to her house. The eyes of the community were on her, some filled with anger, others with disappointment. It was a moment she could neither flee from nor ignore, and she knew the consequences of her actions would linger far beyond this day. Dr. Cartwright stepped forward, her gaze sympathetic yet direct. "Mrs. Blackwell, have you ever taken the time to get to know my daughter and her husband? Have you even considered what their love and presence might bring to this neighborhood?" Edna sputtered, her defenses flaring. I only wanted to protect the community from." "From what, exactly?" Dr. Cartwright cut in, her voice gentle but unyielding. "From joy, from togetherness, from the diversity that makes our world a richer place." Edna fell silent, clutching her hands tightly around the brim of her sun hat. She suddenly felt foolish, as if the entire neighborhood could see right through her, past the carefully crafted persona of a genteel Southern woman to the prejudices that had guided her actions for so long. Meanwhile, the wedding guests, having absorbed the situation, started clapping in an attempt to lift the mood. The warmth and sincerity of their applause wrapped around Michael and Sarah, dispelling the tension and reminding everyone why they were gathered there. The couple, visibly relieved, returned to their places at the altar, Michael taking Sarah's hand in his own. His eyes met hers with a reassuring smile, silently promising that they would not let this incident define their special day. As the ceremony resumed, Edna found herself standing alone on the edge of the gathering, an uninvited onlooker in a scene she had inadvertently marred. She felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, each gaze like a judgment rendered. Her first impulse was to retreat to her house, draw her blinds, and pretend the whole incident hadn't happened. But some force kept her rooted to the spot, forcing her to confront the scene unfolding before her. When the officiant pronounced Michael and Sarah husband and wife, the garden erupted in cheers, hugs, and joyous laughter. Edna felt a pang of envy, a feeling she had long buried in the rituals of her solitary life. She watched as family and friends, of all backgrounds and hues, gathered around the newlyweds, their love and support spilling over like a vibrant tapestry, every thread more beautiful and complex than the last. In that moment, Edna felt more isolated than ever. She was Oakwood Heights' longest-standing resident, and yet she had never felt less at home. It was a realization that cut deep, for she had always prided herself on her connection to the neighborhood. But now she saw that her version of Oakwood Heights, an exclusive, uniform haven, was not what her neighbors valued. Her perspective, once unquestioned, was now painfully out of place. The wedding festivities moved to the reception area, with guests filling their plates and mingling under the soft glow of lanterns. Edna hovered at the periphery, unsure of her place in this new version of Oakwood Heights. Her gaze wandered over the scene, children laughing as they chased each other around tables, neighbors she'd never spoken to before sharing hearty conversations, and even the officers who had responded to her call now laughing along with the guests. For the first time, she felt a genuine curiosity, tinged with regret, for the lives of these people she had so hastily judged. The next morning, Edna awoke with a heaviness in her heart. The remnants of the wedding, streamers, flowers, and chairs, were still scattered in the Johnsons' backyard, evidence of the joy she had tried to sabotage. She didn't leave her house that day, instead spending hours staring out her window, watching as Michael and Sarah received a steady stream of visitors bringing leftover food, hugs, and congratulations. The community had rallied around them in a way that both warmed and unnerved her. 2 days later, Edna's phone began to ring with an unrelenting frequency. Friends, acquaintances, and even distant relatives reached out to express their disapproval of her actions. Some spoke bluntly, others gently, but the message was clear. Her decision to call the police on her neighbors had been a serious misstep, one that had revealed the prejudice she'd carefully kept under wraps for years. But what affected her most were the messages from her neighbors, some of whom she had known for decades. Several left handwritten notes on her doorstep, each expressing their disappointment, some even suggesting she owed the Johnsons an apology. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from Martha Roberts, a woman Edna had shared coffee with every Thursday for nearly a decade. The letter read, "Edna, I've always admired your dedication to this neighborhood. But Oakwood Heights has changed, and so have I. It's time we realize that our community's strength lies in our diversity, in opening ourselves up to people who don't look, think, or live exactly like us. If you can't find it in yourself to accept that, I'm afraid we may have less in common than I once thought. Sincerely, Martha." Edna felt her hands tremble as she read the letter. The sting of her oldest friend's words lingered longer than she expected. The realization that she was becoming a pariah in the very community she once felt she controlled shook her to her core. She had always been Oakwood Heights' gatekeeper, the keeper of its traditions. But now it seemed that she was the one who no longer belonged. The following day, as Edna stepped out onto her porch, she noticed a new addition to her carefully maintained lawn. Small, brightly colored signs had been placed along her walkway, each bearing messages that pierced her heart. "Love thy neighbor," "Hate has no home here," and "Kindness first." She felt her face flush with a mixture of anger and shame as she read each one, the words bearing a silent accusation. Pushing her pride aside, she began gathering the signs, her hand shaking with the weight of the realization that she had become the neighborhood's unwelcome presence. As she pulled up the last sign, she noticed a man walking by. He nodded at her politely but avoided meeting her gaze directly, a gesture that underscored the silent distance forming between her and her neighbors. In the coming days, Edna's world felt increasingly small. Her usual routines, visiting the local coffee shop, tending to her roses, and even strolling around the block, were now tinged with a sense of isolation. Conversations with neighbors grew curt and polite, lacking the warmth they once held. People she'd known for years kept their interactions brief, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they viewed her differently, that they were aware of the side of her she tried so hard to keep hidden. One evening, just as she had begun to accept her new status as the community pariah, she heard a soft knock on her door. She hesitated, unsure of who might be visiting, then opened the door to find an envelope addressed to her in elegant, familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter from Judge Cartwright. Dear Mrs. Blackwell, I understand the difficulty of facing a changing world, particularly when those changes challenge the beliefs we've held for so long. But I believe that your years in Oakwood Heights make you an invaluable part of this community's evolution. My wife and I are hosting a community dialogue on race and inclusion next week at the community center, and I would like to extend a personal invitation to you. Your perspective and your willingness to listen and learn would add immense value. I hope you will consider joining us. Respectfully, Judge William Cartwright. Edna sat with the letter in her hands, her mind racing. She had never imagined herself in a setting like the one described, let alone as a participant. Part of her wanted to dismiss the invitation, to cling to her sense of righteous indignation. But a quieter, deeper part of her recognized this as a chance, a rare opportunity to make things right, to confront the harm she had caused, and perhaps to finally see Oakwood Heights as it truly was, a community bound by the strength of its diversity. Edna placed the letter on her nightstand, its presence a constant reminder of the decision that lay before her. She could choose to stay the course, to shield herself from change, and embrace the isolation she had inadvertently crafted. Or she could take a step forward, vulnerable and uncertain, into a new version of Oakwood Heights that both terrified and intrigued her. As she prepared for bed that night, Edna couldn't shake the memory of Sarah and Michael's wedding, the love that had radiated from their ceremony, the acceptance that had filled their yard. For the first time in her life, Edna Blackwell felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a curiosity, a willingness to consider that her fears might not be the truth, that she could change too. And perhaps, she thought, just perhaps, there was still a place for her in the community she once thought she knew so well. The Bridge of Redemption. The days passed slowly for Mrs. Edna Blackwell. She felt the isolation like a heavy weight, a constant reminder of how drastically her standing in Oakwood Heights had shifted. Neighbors who once waved now turned away, and her cherished weekly coffee with Martha Roberts had ceased without a word. For a woman whose identity had been so entwined with her role as the neighborhood's figurehead, the silence was deafening. Edna often found herself at her kitchen window, gazing out at the street as it bustled with the life from which she now felt detached. Her garden, once her pride, seemed listless, and she struggled to find the motivation to tend to it. Each evening, she reread Judge Cartwright's letter, weighing the invitation like a moral dilemma. The idea of attending a community dialogue on race and inclusion filled her with dread and defensiveness, but her loneliness gnawed at her, eroding her pride one day at a time. A week later, as the day of the community dialogue approached, she made her decision. She would go, if only to show the neighborhood that she wasn't afraid of change. She convinced herself it would be a gesture, a way to regain some footing in the community. But privately, she hoped it would offer her a chance at understanding, to bridge the gap she had created. The night of the dialogue arrived, bringing with it a quiet tension that settled over Oakwood Heights. The meeting was held at the community center, a modest building with a high ceiling and rows of folding chairs arranged in neat lines. Edna dressed carefully, choosing a conservative blouse and her best skirt, hoping to maintain some semblance of dignity. As she walked the few blocks to the center, her steps felt hesitant, as if each one was a reminder of the world she had misjudged. When she arrived, she saw that nearly everyone from Oakwood Heights had gathered. The room was packed with familiar faces, young families, elderly couples, newcomers, and lifelong residents. And there, standing at the front with an air of calm authority, was Judge Cartwright, accompanied by his wife, Dr. Evelyn Cartwright. Edna noticed Michael and Sarah Johnson seated near the front, their fingers intertwined, their expressions serene but resolute. For a brief moment, Edna considered leaving. The idea of facing her neighbor's judgment felt unbearable. But as she turned to go, Judge Cartwright caught her eye and offered a gentle nod. Dr. Cartwright followed suit, her gaze filled with a quiet encouragement that stilled Edna's retreat. Taking a deep breath, She found an empty seat at the back, grateful for the relative anonymity of the shadows. Judge Cartwright began the evening with a warm welcome, acknowledging the courage it took for everyone to come together. He explained that the purpose of the gathering was not to shame anyone, but to open a space for understanding and growth, to address the quiet prejudices and assumptions that too often went unchallenged. His words were measured, resonant, and compassionate, setting a tone that put everyone at ease. The dialogue began with a few community members sharing their stories, speaking openly about the times they had felt unwelcome or misunderstood in Oakwood Heights. Each story revealed a piece of the neighborhood's hidden struggles, subtle acts of exclusion, passing remarks that stung like slaps, and moments of silence that conveyed more judgment than words ever could. As the stories unfolded, Edna listened with a growing sense of discomfort. She recognized in each tale a reflection of her own actions and attitudes. She hadn't seen her behavior as harmful. She had convinced herself it was protective. But now, faced with the real, tangible hurt her neighbors felt, she saw her actions in a new light. Then, Dr. Cartwright invited Sarah to speak. Edna's breath caught in her throat as she watched Sarah stand, her hand still entwined with Michael's. Sarah looked at the audience, her face poised but tender. She began speaking, her voice steady yet deeply personal. Michael and I moved here because we believed in the values this neighborhood represented: community, warmth, a place to belong. But we also knew that we might not be welcomed with open arms. We've encountered it before, this quiet rejection based on our backgrounds and the people we love, Sarah said, glancing at Michael with a sad smile. We hoped this neighborhood would be different, and for the most part, it has been. But we couldn't ignore that our wedding day, meant to be one of joy, was clouded by a call that questioned our right to celebrate our love. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, and a few heads turned in Edna's direction. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes forward, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of their gazes. Sarah continued, her voice unwavering. We've always believed in the power of kindness to bridge differences, and we still believe that. We're not here to blame anyone or to hold grudges. We want Oakwood Heights to be a place where everyone feels safe, where everyone is welcomed. She concluded, her gaze softening as she met Edna's eyes for the first time that night. And that means addressing these issues together, as neighbors, as a community. A heavy silence filled the room, as if every person present held their breath. Edna's eyes stung as Sarah's words settled over her, pressing on her conscience. For years, Edna had considered herself an upstanding citizen, someone who contributed to the fabric of Oakwood Heights. But now she realized that she had woven a thread of exclusion into that fabric, unraveling the very values she claimed to uphold. When Dr. Cartwright opened the floor for comments, Edna felt her heart racing. She knew this was her moment, but the words tangled on her tongue, a mass of excuses, justifications, and, at last, an apology. Taking a steadying breath, she rose from her seat, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she forced herself to continue. I have lived in Oakwood Heights for over 40 years. I have seen people come and go, and I suppose I believed I knew what was best for our community. She began, her voice cracking with each word. But in truth, I've been clinging to a version of this place that doesn't exist anymore, perhaps never existed. A hush settled over the room, and Edna felt her vulnerability exposed, raw and unguarded. She glanced at Michael and Sarah, who were watching her with expressions of quiet compassion, and drew courage from their forgiveness. I'm ashamed of what I did, of how I acted out of fear and ignorance, she continued, her voice breaking. I thought I was protecting Oakwood Heights, but in reality, I was protecting myself from change, from people I didn't understand, from the fear of becoming irrelevant in a world that's evolving faster than I could keep up with. Edna paused, her hands wringing tightly together. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to be a part of this community, truly a part of it, not as an outsider looking in. I want to learn, to grow, and to understand what it means to be a neighbor in today's Oakwood Heights. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Edna felt her hands shake as she returned to her seat, her heart pounding with the vulnerability of her admission. She had expected resistance, perhaps even condemnation. But what she hadn't expected was the gentle applause that followed, a sound that seemed to wash over her, lifting the weight that had pressed on her for so long. After a moment, a young woman near the front stood up. She was someone Edna had only seen in passing, a recent addition to Oakwood Heights. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell," she said simply. "We've all made mistakes, but it's never too late to change." The meeting continued, with more voices joining in, each one offering stories of struggle, hope, and resilience. As the evening wore on, Edna felt a surprising lightness. The community wasn't shunning her. Instead, they were inviting her back into its heart. She felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar yet profoundly comforting, a chance at redemption, at true belonging. When the dialogue concluded, people lingered, mingling and chatting, sharing connections they had never known before. Edna hesitated, unsure if anyone would want to speak with her. But before she could slip away, Michael approached, his expression warm. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Blackwell," he said, his voice genuine. "It means a lot that you were here tonight." Edna looked at him, her eyes damp with emotion. "I'm sorry, Michael. I truly am. I didn't know how to. I didn't understand." He nodded, a soft smile on his face. "Understanding is a journey, Mrs. Blackwell. We're all learning. It means a lot that you're willing to start." Sarah joined them, extending her hand. Edna took it, feeling the warmth and strength in Sarah's grip, and she marveled at the kindness extended to her despite all she had done. "You'll always have a place here, Mrs. Blackwell. We're glad you're part of our community," Sarah said, her voice filled with sincerity. As she left the community center that night, Edna felt as if she were seeing Oakwood Heights with new eyes. The streetlights cast a gentle glow over the familiar houses, the sidewalks where she had once walked with a sense of ownership. But now, she realized, Oakwood Heights wasn't hers to guard or control. It was a shared space, a place that thrived on the diversity and warmth of its residents. As she crossed her threshold, Edna felt a quiet peace settle over her. She knew that her journey toward redemption was only beginning, that the work of unlearning years of prejudice and fear would not happen overnight. But for the first time, she felt ready to embrace the change she had once resisted, to open her heart to the people she had kept at a distance. In that moment, standing alone in her house, she felt the first stirrings of hope. A hope rooted not in the past, but in the future, a future she now saw as brighter and more inclusive than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. New beginnings and old wounds. After the community dialogue, Edna Blackwell's life began to shift, gradually but unmistakably. For years, she had avoided change, guarding her life and neighborhood with a fierce attachment to tradition. But now, having glimpsed the joy and unity among her neighbors, Edna couldn't ignore the narrowness of her old perspective. The dialogue had forced her to confront the harm she'd caused and offered her a glimpse of something richer, an Oakwood Heights that embraced diversity, welcomed new ideas, and fostered genuine connection. Edna spent her first few days in quiet reflection, finding herself oddly reluctant to return to her usual routines. Her daily walk through the neighborhood, once her way of asserting her presence, now felt different. She could sense a newfound awareness in her interactions with others, a softness in her approach, a willingness to listen. But this openness didn't come without pain. Some neighbors still avoided her, their expressions polite but distant, as if they weren't yet ready to forgive her. Martha Roberts, her longtime friend, had sent only a brief, stilted text after the dialogue. "Thank you for sharing, Edna. Let's catch up soon." Yet, a part of Edna knew that soon might never come. Martha had been deeply disappointed in her, and while the rest of the neighborhood might eventually forgive, Martha's friendship was among the deepest losses. Yet, for each cold shoulder she encountered, there were moments of warmth that took her by surprise. One afternoon, while tending her garden, she saw Mrs. Alvarez, a young mother she had rarely spoken to, walking by with her two small children. Edna waved, half expecting no response, but to her surprise, Mrs. Alvarez stopped and returned the gesture. "Your roses are beautiful, Mrs. Blackwell," she said, smiling shyly. "My little ones love to walk by and see them every morning." Edna felt a small warmth in her chest. "Thank you, dear," she replied, her voice soft. She crouched down, clipping a few of her prized blooms and offering them to Mrs. Alvarez. "For the little ones." Mrs. Alvarez accepted the roses with a grateful smile, and as they walked away, Edna felt a flicker of hope. These small gestures, she realized, were her way of rebuilding what she had broken. As the weeks passed, she began to see Michael and Sarah Johnson more often. The couple's once foreign friendliness now seemed like a lifeline, each encounter a chance for Edna to stretch beyond her comfort zone. She often saw them on their evening walks, and one evening, summoning her courage, she invited them over for tea. To her surprise, they accepted, and the following Saturday, they arrived at her doorstep with a basket of fresh fruit and a card that read simply, "For new friends." The gesture, though small, left Edna both touched and a little ashamed. Their kindness was so freely given, even after everything she had put them through. As they settled in for tea, Edna took a breath, steeling herself for a difficult conversation. She hadn't yet had a chance to personally apologize, and though she'd spoken at the community dialogue, she knew she owed them a direct apology. "Michael, Sarah," she began, her hands trembling slightly as she held her teacup, "I wanted to thank you for coming over today. I know it may not be easy, and I'm aware that I've given you both plenty of reason to feel uncomfortable here in Oakwood Heights." Michael and Sarah shared a glance, their expressions warm but cautious. Sarah placed her hand over Edna's. "Mrs. Blackwell, we're here because we want to move forward. We believe in forgiveness and in the possibility of change." Edna felt a knot form in her throat, the humility of their response leaving her at a loss for words. She could only nod, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. After a moment, she managed to speak. "I know I can't erase what happened," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I do want to make it right, in whatever way I can. I've spent so much of my life holding on to fear, and I see now that it's held me back from knowing people like you. Kind, good-hearted people who only wanted to belong." Michael leaned forward, his expression gentle but direct. "Mrs. Blackwell, we understand. It's a journey for all of us. We've faced prejudice before, and while it's painful, we're learning to see each moment as an opportunity for change. If you're willing to grow with us, we're willing to have you in our lives." Edna felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for their grace, their willingness to open their hearts despite her past actions. For the first time, she saw her neighbors not as people to categorize and control, but as individuals, each with their own story, struggle, and strength. Their conversation continued, moving from difficult confessions to shared stories and laughter. Michael recounted a tale from his travels abroad, while Sarah talked about her work with children and her dreams of starting a community health clinic. Edna found herself engrossed, laughing at their jokes and marveling at their resilience. In their company, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging not rooted in control, but in genuine connection. As they finished their tea, Sarah looked around at Edna's rose garden visible through the window. "Mrs. Blackwell, your roses are incredible. I'd love to learn how to grow flowers like these." Edna felt a rush of pride and joy, a warmth she hadn't expected. "I'd be delighted to teach you," she replied, her voice lifting with excitement. "Gardening requires patience, care, and a willingness to get your hands dirty, qualities I think you already have in abundance." The three of them laughed, and as Michael and Sarah left that evening, Edna watched them walk down the path with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. She closed the door, feeling lighter, as if she had taken her first steps onto a path of healing, not only for herself, but for the community she had almost lost. Over the next several weeks, Edna threw herself into her newfound purpose with a zeal that surprised even her. She joined the community's new Inclusion Committee, a group formed from the community dialogue to plan events, address concerns, and promote the values of diversity and unity in Oakwood Heights. She found herself working alongside people she'd once ignored or avoided, listening to ideas and perspectives that challenged her but also expanded her understanding of her neighbors' lives. One evening, as the committee was meeting to plan a community potluck, Edna found herself at a table with teenagers who had recently moved into the neighborhood, their energy and excitement both contagious and intimidating. They talked about the foods they wanted to bring, and one of the boys, Javier, suggested a salsa dancing demonstration. "Do you know how to dance salsa, Mrs. Blackwell?" he asked with a mischievous grin, knowing full well the answer. Edna chuckled, holding up her hands. "I wouldn't know where to begin," she admitted, her face crinkling in amusement. "But I'd be willing to try if someone taught me." The teens exchanged excited glances, and before she knew it, Edna found herself roped into a mini salsa lesson, her laughter ringing through the community center as she attempted to follow Javier's steps. She was far from graceful, but the joy on her face, the pure delight of letting go of her fears, was infectious. The potluck itself was a beautiful tapestry of cultures, flavors, and shared experiences. Edna marveled at the variety of foods, from Vietnamese spring rolls to Jamaican jerk chicken, dishes she had never tasted but now eagerly tried. Conversations flowed easily, and for the first time, Edna felt fully embraced by the community she had once tried to control. Towards the end of the evening, as people began to leave, Edna saw Martha Roberts standing near the door, watching her with a hesitant expression. Taking a deep breath, Edna approached her old friend, hoping for an opportunity to mend the rift that had formed between them. "Martha," she said softly, her heart racing, "I know I disappointed you, and I understand if you need time. But I hope that someday we can find a way back to where we were." Martha looked at her, her eyes a mixture of sadness and affection. "Edna, I won't pretend it didn't hurt, seeing a side of you I never knew existed. But watching you these past weeks, seeing the effort you're making, it gives me hope." Edna's eyes welled up, and she placed a hand on Martha's arm. "I don't want to lose you, Martha. You've been my friend for so long. I promise I'm trying to change." Martha smiled, pulling Edna into a gentle hug. "And I'm here to help you," she said softly. "One day at a time." The embrace was tentative, yet it carried the promise of forgiveness, of healing, and of a friendship that could weather even the deepest wounds. As the weeks turned into months, Edna continued to rebuild her life in Oakwood Heights, each day a step closer to the community she had once misunderstood. She spent more time with the Johnsons, teaching Sarah to tend roses and sharing stories from her past. The two women, so different in age and background, found a friendship that surprised them both, rooted in respect and the mutual joy of learning from one another. Edna also became close with other neighbors, people she had once dismissed. She found herself opening her heart, sharing her table, and listening to the stories that filled Oakwood Heights with life and color. And with each interaction, each small act of kindness and openness, Edna felt her world expanding, her heart embracing a diversity she had once feared. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, she thought back to the wedding day that had set all of this in motion. What had once been a source of shame was now the beginning of her redemption, the bridge that had led her from isolation to belonging. In her heart, she knew there would still be challenges, days when she felt tempted to slip back into her old ways. But she also knew that, surrounded by the warmth of her neighbors and the strength of her newfound friendships, she was no longer alone. Oakwood Heights had become more than just her home. It was her family, her place of growth, and her redemption. And as she looked out over the street, seeing children playing, neighbors chatting, and the lights of the Johnsons' house glowing warmly next door, Edna finally felt at peace. She had become a true part of Oakwood Heights, a place defined not by exclusivity, but by unity, understanding, and love. The ripple of change. Months after Edna Blackwell's awakening, Oakwood Heights had transformed in ways that not even its oldest residents could have anticipated. The small incidents of connection and openness among neighbors had grown into a wave of change, enveloping the entire community. Diversity, once merely tolerated, was now embraced as a strength, a foundation for a neighborhood that thrived on inclusivity and mutual support. Edna's life, once defined by isolation and routine, was now filled with vibrant friendships and daily surprises. Her mornings were no longer solitary rituals. Instead, they began with neighborhood strolls where she stopped to greet families, wave to passing teens, and even chat with Michael and Sarah, who often joined her. Her journey to understanding had become a point of inspiration to others, even those who, like Edna once had, clung to old biases. But this newfound harmony wasn't without challenges. With Oakwood Heights' reputation growing, it became the target of media attention, drawing interest from local reporters eager to spotlight the transformation of the neighborhood, once known for its exclusivity. The mayor's office took particular interest, seeing an opportunity to use Oakwood Heights as a model for community inclusion in the city. Invitations arrived for residents to share their story, and Edna, as one of the community's most surprising voices for change, found herself receiving requests for interviews. One afternoon, Edna received a call from the city's most prominent news channel. The host invited her to share her story on air, suggesting it could inspire others in neighboring communities. Nervous but eager to help her community, Edna agreed, seeing it as a chance to contribute to the broader dialogue on acceptance and understanding. The day of the interview was filled with a nervous energy that left Edna feeling like a schoolgirl. She hadn't been in the spotlight since the community dialogue months earlier, and though her neighbors had forgiven her, she feared dredging up her past mistakes. As she arrived at the studio, Michael and Sarah joined her for support, their encouraging smiles steadying her nerves. The interview began with a montage of Oakwood Heights' transformation, a series of clips showing potlucks, cultural festivals, and neighbors working together. The host, a polished young woman named Carmen, turned to Edna with a warm smile. "Mrs. Blackwell," she began, "your story has become a symbol of transformation and hope, not only for Oakwood Heights but for communities across our city. Can you tell us what changed for you personally, and how that change impacted your neighborhood?" Edna paused, her hands trembling slightly as she glanced at Michael and Sarah. They nodded, giving her the strength to continue. "It's strange to think of myself as a symbol of change," she began, her voice steady but soft. "For most of my life, I saw Oakwood Heights as a place I needed to protect. I thought I was preserving our values by keeping things the same. But I see now that I was holding the community back, not protecting it. Fear was clouding my judgment, making me see my neighbors not as individuals, but as threats to some idea of stability that I thought I needed." The host listened attentively, nodding for Edna to continue. "After Michael and Sarah's wedding, I was forced to confront that fear. I didn't want to admit I was wrong, but seeing the joy, the love in their lives, it showed me what I was missing. I realized that Oakwood Heights wasn't just a place for people who looked like me, thought like me, or came from my background. It's a place for everyone, and each person brings something invaluable to our community." Carmen leaned forward, her face bright with interest. "And what advice would you give to others who may feel the way you once did?" Edna took a deep breath, the words coming from a place of genuine humility. "I would tell them that change is difficult, even scary. But if we open ourselves to it, if we're willing to listen, learn, and let go of our need to control, it can lead to a life filled with connections that are deeper, more meaningful than anything we could create on our own." The interview concluded, and Edna returned home feeling a mixture of relief and pride. She had spoken not as an advocate, but as a woman still on her journey, humbly embracing the community she had once misunderstood. To her surprise, neighbors began approaching her more openly, sharing their own stories and asking questions, looking to her as an example not just of change, but of the courage it took to admit her mistakes. Shortly after the interview, Oakwood Heights received an unexpected visitor. Officer David Martinez, one of the officers who had responded to Edna's call on the day of the wedding. Like Edna, Martinez had been profoundly impacted by the incident, realizing that his initial acceptance of her assumptions had reflected his own unconscious biases. Since then, he had worked to implement implicit bias training in his department and initiated community policing initiatives that encouraged officers to build relationships with residents rather than simply responding to complaints. Officer Martinez met with Edna, Michael, Sarah, and other members of the neighborhood at the community center, where he shared his experience. "The day of your wedding, I realized that I had been too quick to accept a situation at face value," he said, his voice reflective. "It's our duty to question assumptions, to see people for who they are and not what our biases might suggest. This neighborhood has taught me the importance of connecting with people, not just policing them." Michael and Sarah thanked him, and the group discussed ways to strengthen relationships between the police and the community, establishing a partnership that made residents feel safe and respected. Together, they crafted a program inviting officers to attend neighborhood events, volunteer at local schools, and meet with residents over informal gatherings. This effort went beyond Oakwood Heights, drawing interest from other neighborhoods in the city. The transformation had become a ripple, spreading outward and fostering a city-wide conversation on community and trust. Months passed, and Edna continued to embrace her role in the neighborhood's evolution. She found herself volunteering at the local library, helping children with reading programs, organizing gardening workshops, and even speaking at events to share her journey. Her friendship with Michael and Sarah deepened as she became more involved in their lives, finding herself as a part of their family. Sarah's parents, Judge and Dr. Cartwright, frequently visited, joining the Johnsons for dinners at Edna's house, where they exchanged stories, laughter, and encouragement. One day, as Edna sat with the Cartwrights over tea, Judge Cartwright leaned toward her, his expression thoughtful. "Edna," he began, "it seems you've become something of a local figurehead for change. Have you ever thought about using your influence to start a program? Something that can teach others what you've learned, that could help other neighborhoods struggling with similar issues?" Edna laughed, surprised by the suggestion. "Me? An advocate for change? I wouldn't know where to begin." Dr. Cartwright smiled warmly. "You've already begun, Edna. Your story has inspired so many here in Oakwood Heights. Imagine how much good you could do if you shared it with others." The idea planted a seed in Edna's mind, one that she couldn't shake. After considering it over the next few weeks, she approached Michael and Sarah with a proposal. Together, they decided to create a community initiative called Neighbors in Unity, an organization focused on fostering inclusivity, open dialogue, and mutual respect in neighborhoods across the city. With support from local leaders, Neighbors in Unity quickly grew from an idea into a movement. They developed workshops, community dialogues, and educational programs, many of which drew from Edna's experiences. The organization held events where people could discuss their fears, confront their biases, and learn from one another in a safe and supportive environment. As the organization gained momentum, Edna found herself busier than ever. She traveled to nearby neighborhoods, shared her story at schools, community centers, and even city council meetings, urging others to see their neighbors not as strangers, but as people with shared hopes and dreams. Her message was simple, that change begins with a willingness to connect, to embrace, and to love. One evening, Neighbors in Unity held its first city-wide gathering in Oakwood Heights, an event that drew hundreds of attendees. The community center was transformed, filled with food from around the world, cultural performances, and tables where residents could sit together and share stories. Edna looked around, her heart swelling with pride as she saw people from all walks of life, laughing, connecting, and embracing the very values she had once resisted. As the evening wore on, Edna found herself seated beside Martha Roberts, her old friend who had been one of the few to challenge her during her difficult transformation. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching children dance and families share food. Martha finally turned to her, a gentle smile on her face. "You know, Edna," she said softly, "I never thought I'd see Oakwood Heights like this. You've done something remarkable." Edna felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her here. "I didn't do this alone, Martha," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Oakwood Heights taught me how to be a better person, a better neighbor. This community saved me." Martha reached out, squeezing Edna's hand. "And you've saved this community, Edna. You've helped us find a new kind of strength." As the night continued, Edna realized that her story, once filled with regret, was now woven into the fabric of Oakwood Heights' identity. She had gone from being its gatekeeper to its bridge builder, uniting people who had once felt like outsiders and welcoming them as neighbors and friends. In the weeks following the gathering, Neighbors in Unity continued to grow, and Edna found herself more fulfilled than she had ever imagined. She spent her days working with people from every corner of the city, helping them forge the same bonds of understanding and empathy that had transformed Oakwood Heights. Her life, once narrow and guarded, had expanded into a legacy of connection and love. And as she walked the streets of Oakwood Heights, greeting families, waving to children, and exchanging kind words with neighbors old and new, Edna knew that her story was far from over. She had become not just a resident of Oakwood Heights, but a steward of its heart, a living testament to the power of humility, forgiveness, and the boundless possibilities of change. A legacy of unity. The years rolled by, and the story of Oakwood Heights' transformation became legend, spreading across the city, then the state, and even reaching national attention. The neighborhood's once insular reputation had blossomed into a model of inclusivity and community engagement. Edna Blackwell, now in her 80s, had become a beloved figure, not just in Oakwood Heights, but in communities near and far. Her journey from isolation and fear to open-hearted unity resonated deeply, inspiring others to confront their own prejudices and find strength in diversity. Neighbors in Unity, the organization Edna had co-founded with Michael and Sarah Johnson, had flourished beyond her wildest dreams. What had begun as small gatherings and local events evolved into a fully fledged nonprofit that provided workshops, educational programs, and resources to neighborhoods across the country. Through Neighbors in Unity, Edna's journey was immortalized in a curriculum designed to foster community dialogue, bridge divides, and encourage the understanding and empathy that had been so transformative for her. Oakwood Heights itself was unrecognizable from the neighborhood Edna had once fiercely guarded. The streets, once lined with identical houses and families who shared her background, were now a vibrant mix of cultures and generations. On any given day, children played on the sidewalks, parents from all walks of life greeted each other, and elders from diverse backgrounds gathered to share stories. Festivals celebrating various heritages filled the calendar year-round, with events for Diwali, Lunar New Year, and Juneteenth joining the town's traditional holiday parades. For Edna, watching this transformation had become her life's greatest joy. On warm afternoons, she would sit on her porch and observe the bustling street, filled with laughter and the comforting hum of life. Her roses had become a community fixture, drawing neighbors young and old, who would stop by to admire the flowers, ask her for gardening tips, or simply chat about their day. In many ways, her roses had become a symbol of Oakwood Heights itself. Cultivated, pruned, and nurtured with care, their growth only made more beautiful by their diversity. One summer evening, Oakwood Heights hosted its annual Festival of Unity, a celebration created to honor the neighborhood's transformation. Families brought dishes representing their heritage, musicians performed traditional songs from around the world, and local artists showcased works inspired by the neighborhood's journey. The festival had grown with each passing year, attracting people from surrounding towns who came to witness the thriving spirit of Oakwood Heights. This particular year, Edna had been asked to give the keynote speech. She had agreed, albeit with a familiar flutter of nervousness. Despite all she had done, Edna still saw herself as a humble resident, an old woman who had simply opened her heart to change. But she knew this was an important moment, a chance to share her story with the new generation. The festival was held at Oakwood Heights Park, a space that had once been a quiet, sparsely used patch of land, but had since transformed into a gathering place filled with playgrounds, a community garden, and a pavilion for events. As the evening sun cast a golden glow over the crowd, Edna made her way to the podium. Greeted by the warm applause of friends, neighbors, and newcomers who had heard her story. Taking a deep breath, Edna began to speak, her voice both steady and softened by age. "When I first moved to Oakwood Heights, I thought I understood what community meant," she said, her eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. "I thought that unity was about sameness, that by keeping things as they were, I was protecting the values that mattered most. But over the years, I learned that true unity isn't built by excluding those who are different. It's built by opening our hearts to them." She paused, her mind drifting back to that pivotal day when she had called the police on Michael and Sarah's wedding, a decision that now seemed worlds away from the life she led. "It took me far too long to see the truth," she continued, "but in opening my heart, I found a community that was richer, kinder, and stronger than anything I could have imagined. I'm grateful every day that Oakwood Heights welcomed me back, that you allowed me to change and gave me a second chance." A murmur of agreement and applause rippled through the audience, with many smiling and nodding. Michael and Sarah, standing at the front with their young children, beamed up at Edna, their gratitude evident. The Cartwrights, now even more respected for their continued civil rights work, looked on with pride, their lives forever intertwined with Edna's journey. Edna continued, her voice growing more impassioned. "Neighbors in Unity began as a way to help Oakwood Heights heal, but it has become a beacon of hope for communities everywhere. We've proven that change is possible, that people from different backgrounds, races, and beliefs can come together, not just to live side by side, but to thrive together as one." Her words were met with applause, but Edna wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice steady. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without courage. Each of us has to be brave enough to confront our own fears, our own prejudices, and when we do, we find that the reward is a life filled with friendships, with understanding, and with love." As she finished, the crowd erupted in applause. People stood, clapping and cheering, many with tears in their eyes, moved by Edna's words and the profound transformation they symbolized. It was a moment of triumph, not just for Edna, but for every person in Oakwood Heights who had worked to make the neighborhood a place of acceptance and unity. After her speech, Edna spent the evening wandering through the festival, greeting neighbors, shaking hands, and listening to stories from people who had been inspired by her journey. She was hugged by strangers, thanked by families, and even danced a few hesitant steps with Javier, now a young man who had remained one of her favorite teachers since their salsa lesson years ago. As the night wore on, she found herself sitting beside Michael and Sarah, their young children snuggled against their laps as they watched the festivities. She reached over, squeezing Sarah's hand, her eyes twinkling with gratitude. "Thank you both," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I never could have imagined this life. You gave me a gift I can never repay." Michael shook his head, a warm smile on his face. "Edna, you didn't just find your way back to Oakwood Heights. You brought this neighborhood to life. We owe so much of this to you." Edna chuckled, brushing away a tear. "Oh, I don't know about that. I just stumbled my way forward. It was all of you who showed me the way." As the years passed, Neighbors in Unity continued to grow, with new chapters forming in communities across the country. Edna's story became the heart of its mission, reminding others that transformation was always possible, that courage and compassion could change the most hardened of hearts. In her later years, as Edna's health began to decline, Oakwood Heights rallied around her in the same spirit of unity she had once fought to preserve. Neighbors brought her meals, tended her roses, and spent time sharing stories that filled her days with warmth and laughter. Children she had once watched from a distance now visited regularly, bringing homemade cards, drawings, and bouquets from her garden, a cherished symbol of the community's unity. One day, Sarah and Michael visited her with a surprise. They had named the newest addition to their family, Eleanor, or Ellie, in her honor, a gesture that left Edna overwhelmed with gratitude. "Little Ellie's got some big shoes to fill," Michael teased, earning a laugh from Edna, who held the tiny baby in her arms, marveling at the life she'd helped to nurture, the legacy she would leave behind. When Edna passed away peacefully one spring morning, the entire neighborhood mourned the loss of its cherished matriarch. The news spread quickly, and people gathered on her front lawn, leaving roses, notes, and messages of thanks. The Cartwrights, Michael, Sarah, and countless others stood together, remembering the woman who had changed their lives by first changing her own heart. In the weeks that followed, the community dedicated the garden in Oakwood Heights Park to Edna's memory, planting her favorite roses alongside flowers from the diverse backgrounds of Oakwood Heights residents. A plaque was installed at the garden's entrance, inscribed with words that reflected her journey. "In memory of Edna Blackwell, may her courage to change remind us all that true community is built on understanding, love, and unity." The dedication ceremony was a bittersweet event, filled with stories, laughter, and above all, gratitude for the woman who had once struggled to embrace change, but ultimately became the heart of Oakwood Heights. Years later, children would learn of Edna's story in school, and her life would become a testament to the power of humility, forgiveness, and community. The park's garden, a flourishing display of roses, lilies, and sunflowers, remained a gathering place where families picnicked, friends shared laughter, and neighbors, new and old, found a place to belong. Edna's legacy lived on in every handshake, every shared meal, and every neighborly smile exchanged in Oakwood Heights. She had become a permanent thread in the fabric of the neighborhood, a reminder that love, courage, and unity could build a community stronger than anything fear or prejudice could tear down. Her life, once marked by isolation, had blossomed into a symbol of hope, leaving behind a world forever changed.